My first chart looks at the heartbeat of every organization, and I believe that's the case because it's like just like the body. Any blockage effect will affect the entire system. And one weak link causes a system failure in the supply chain. So we are the ones that hold all the functions together. So I believe that everyone who works in supply chain knows the importance of supply chain and the fact that if we contract wrongly, we use vendors that are not ethical, we also use vendors that are not reliable, we can bring the business to a halt, including suppliers who keep on increasing the prices as they go along. So it's very important for us to know that supply chain plays a central part of every institution. Next slide, please. So when the supply chain moved to the spotlight, I mean, we haven't been as glamorous as a marketing department who make the brands come alive. Supply chain has been known to be a more transactional department where even sometimes you have user departments coming through with 3 quotations. They'll come to your desk and say, I've requested for some quotations from 3 vendors, so you can now do the comparison. We all know that supply chain is not mainly about that. That sometimes we are measured by how we work in the background and we don't come to the forefront. But we should know that we have to protect the revenue. Each company does a budget towards the end of every year. So if we're in 2026, then the budget should have been done towards the last quarter of last year. So we need to protect the revenue and not necessarily meet the budget as is, but to also make sure that we work within the budget and optimize whatever we have to spend. Supply chain is also about adding value and not just doing exactly what people expect you to do. And also safeguard the reputation of the company you're working with or whatever institution it is, to make sure that when you're onboarding vendors, you make sure the vendors go through the right process and make sure they are ethical vendors and they have all the requirements that is needed for the business, so that if anything goes wrong, we know that whoever we are contracting with are the right people. I've already mentioned that it is a strategic function, and we might have to make sure that there are no delays and shortages in the system based on how embedded the processes are within the business. Now, expectations have risen because it's not about who can deliver the fastest. When you are actually doing your comparison to pick up a vendor, you're not looking at the vendor who can deliver a laptop within 2 weeks, but will be more expensive. You're going to compare your costs, your delivery time, and other parameters that will give the business value for money. So we are looking at adding value to the business. So it's not just about the faster delivery and all of that, but other areas I've mentioned, such as ethical sourcing, digital transparency, etc., and making sure that these suppliers are financially stable to support the business. Because can you imagine working with a company who always would come to us for advance payment before they deliver? They must be able to deliver, and after delivery, depending on the company you work for, if it's 30 days after payment, after delivery, then they take their payment after delivery. If it's 60 days after delivery, then that's what happens. We want suppliers who are financially stable. So the question is that it's no longer whether disruptions will occur, but now we want to ensure that supply chain people are ready to respond. So we're not waiting for something to happen, then someone comes up as a hero to say that I managed to deliver the items on time, but rather to predict ahead of time to ensure that we are ready to meet the business needs. Next slide, please. So what has changed on the ground? I've spoken about a few factors, and I believe my colleagues have also done the same. Things have changed because we want a supply chain to be more effective, to use data more, and I heard Peter mentioning about AI. I mean, people are more dependent on AI now, and it is useful to be able to sort out your data and see who your best vendor is to help with your measuring your SLEs with which vendor you're looking at and making sure that you follow through with all of those things. So we are now more resilient. We have to be more resilient now, and it's just resilience over efficiency as well. Cost optimization is now gone. It's not about the lowest cost alone, because we mentioned that it's from end to end. And then redundancies and buffers are strategic checks now. Those are the things that we need to look at. So what are leaders doing differently now? Leaders must be designing systems and not just running transactions. We should be shying away from firefighting and making sure these are sorted out before the problem happens. We must be leading across the ecosystem and not just functions, and be treating its supply chain as a shared system and not just a function. So leaders in supply chain have evolved. And in 2026 going forward, we need to see this happening within all the functions or all the departments in supply chain. So if you have a procurement department, you have a warehousing department, you have maybe a due diligence department, facilities and fleets, or whatever department you have with supply chain, they will have to be working much differently going forward in 2026. Next slide, please. I believe the other speakers have spoken about the three key areas we've been looking at, and I'm also looking at the same. And I will not go too much in detail for this, but we've all looked at expectations, the risk, and the institutional reality for supply chains in 2026. And we have mentioned, I'm sure all three of us have mentioned, being resilient, digital, making sure we're using all the numbers to decide on the way forward, and of course, be sustainable. Those are the three key areas, and I'm sure there are more under expectations. For the risk, there are several risks as well, and I believe Prof has already gone through geopolitics and all of those, including disruption and volatility. Those we already expect. And as mentioned earlier, it's not about waiting for the disaster to happen and then you come up as a hero. You predict and ensure that you have a backup for that. So a simple example is that if you work in a telecom like I do, you would make sure you have a backup for SIM cards, for example, because without SIM cards, I mean, you can't really go forward, can you? So you make sure you have a backup. So it's either you have a backup vendor, possibly in different countries, to ensure that if there's any wars or borders are shut, you can still get your SIM card. You'd also would increase your buffer stocks. So these are things that you would do in conjunction with the business to ensure that your stock levels are enough to ensure that you don't actually run out of the business now comes to a halt. And the institutional reality, which I'm sure we've all mentioned, is about being sustainable. We always have to look at processes and materials we're using, all of those things to ensure that we are sustainable going forward. And compliance. As a supply chain, we do go through a lot of audits, and it's important that we actually meet and exceed expectations for our processes. So make sure we comply to all the processes and the policies that we have to ensure that we can also make sure that we don't go outside the processes. And of course, be transparent with all our results, transparent with who we select. And you find that in most mature companies, there are cross-functional teams who sit together to select a vendor. So it's not two or three people huddled in a corner who decide that supplier A has to be the one. So you have tender committee meetings where a vendor is selected based on so many different factors, including their experience, who their clients have been, how soon they can deliver, and of course, after sales service. We don't want someone who delivers something and then that's the end of the story, but there should be warranties and after sales service. Next slide, please. So similar to what I've shared, these are some of the expectations that we want to see in 2026 and that we've crossed the permanent threshold. So there will always be uncertainty. We went through COVID. There'll be so many things going forward with issues in the US and so many different countries. There could be wars, borders could be closed. So we must work with uncertainty and look for backups to ensure that the supply chain does not break. And not crisis recovery. Sometimes when there's a crisis and it's resolved, people feel quite time is no longer what we have now, because there must be a movement, there must be improvements and all of that. So the teams were taught to forecast. So they had to forecast, they had quarterly forecasts, rolling forecasts. And I'm sure now, since I left the ages ago, I'm sure the teams there are now using AI to help them predict the sales of whether it be soaps, be it margarine, be it washing liquid. They must be using AI to do that, to help them to reduce their forecast bias and be able to plan adequately so that they don't have so many crises with shortages. Next slide, please. So more expectations. We are expecting that we will not source from single countries. I spoke about SIM cards or single suppliers, but you would source from multiple to ensure there's a backup. That is one of the things you need to do. Not wait for a crisis and say, we only have one vendor for this key ingredient or this key material, so there's going to be a gap. We also expect to include multi-tier supply diversification. So we have like a tier 1, tier 2, and a tier 3, where the tier 1s are the direct suppliers who are giving the finished products, and the tier 2 were the suppliers supplying to a tier 1, and then tier 3 are also those supplying to tier 2 with raw materials. So it has to include multi-tiered supply diversification. And if you recall, in one of the earlier slides, I mentioned that supply chain leaders have to now be designing how the supply chain is going to be. Think about how or where you source your things from and how solid your backup is to avoid the gaps in supply. This includes nearshoring and regional sourcing, etc. Again, I'll give an example from Unilever, where at some point Ghana was producing Fractal, producing Omo, toothpaste, and all of that. And the management or leaders decided that why don't we produce some of the key finished products in Ghana and the rest in Nigeria. So it took a while to plan, and then some things were moved to Nigeria. So Ghana being a hub for raw materials, palm oil, which was a key ingredient for almost all the products that remain in Ghana. We're producing the soaps in Ghana and the Fractal in Ghana, and the rest were being produced in Nigeria for efficiency. And I would expect these to happen more for the FMCGs and those who produce lots of finished products. Next slide, please. So again, go back to digital monitoring, where we say it is not a leadership requirement. Everybody uses AI now, whether to send a message, whether to analyze some data to see who your highest spend is, to be able to determine who your strategic vendors are. So AI will sort these out for you. However, in the absence of AI, like my colleague mentioned, you must be able to use the normal Excel and all those other tools to be able to determine results from your data. So again, visibility is important, and then predictive risk alerts are also important to ensure that you don't have any gaps in your supply chain. Next slide, please. I believe this has been discussed, is about the ecosystem, making sure that whether your suppliers, your banks, your logistics, your ports, and all of those are in sync with your supply chain, to ensure that you engage your regulators early, to ensure that if you have to work with the Food and Drugs Board for extension or any expiry dates, coming to check your raw materials, you do that. If it's for a telco, to ensure that we make sure that the NCA is also aligned to what we're doing. Okay, so we also want to talk about collaboration with suppliers and partners are replacing transactional relationships. So you realize that for supply chain, mature supply chains have a lot of supply relationship management, because it's important that you see your suppliers as partners. That's where you'd have a supplier come to tell you that this is going to happen in August of this year, so this is the way we can go. You also have a supplier telling you that this material is now no longer effective. So now if you're doing a kiosk for someone to sell something from it, it's no longer going to be metal. It now has to be this material. So together, you work towards a specification to improve. And this is important for your strategic vendors because you don't see them as a one-off vendor, but these are the ones who help the business to grow. Next slide, please. It's all about costs. Each time you go to a boardroom, it's about costs. There's never any team in the boardroom who would welcome high costs. They always want you to ensure that you're actually meeting your targets or way below. But again, like we mentioned from the beginning, it is not about the lowest cost because it has the total cost of ownership. You are looking from beginning to end. So it's not just buying the item alone, but it's how it's going to be serviced, the warranties, and of course, after life has retired as well. So it's important that the costs are maintained, but along the chain. So not just the one-off cost alone. And some of the leaders all leaders must balance the affordability, the margins, and the long risk exposure. There's no point in getting a material or an equipment that would be obsolete in the next few years. You're looking for a long-term use for the business. And I mentioned about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And you realize that a lot of risk sits within the tier 2 and tier 3 where the raw materials are being done. So it's important if it's, for example, cocoa board or a chocolate company that's buying cocoa from the farmers. The cocoa from tier 2 and tier 3 are secured, and there will be no gaps in supply, all within maintaining the costs from the beginning. Next slide, please. I believe this has already been spoken about, so I'll skip to the next slide on institutional reality. So I just want to recap again about supply chain leaders being designers. And I said that in relation to formulation of policies and other things that would ensure that they are working together with IT for shaping the business going forward. So it's not just the supply of materials. We are looking at end-to-end, looking from, as a diagram predicts, from retailers to manufacturers to logistics, all those key people in the chain. The supply chain leader is looking at all of that to ensure that there's a smooth flow from beginning to end. And they also include their partners. You work with IT if you're using an ERP system like Oracle to ensure that it's giving you exactly what you require to make sure there's a smooth relationship with yourself and the suppliers, and the output is clear, and also being able to monitor all of this. So the role is strategic and adaptive, like it says, and also enterprise-wide. Next slide, please. So back on institutional reality, we look at the enterprise risk structure, and we look at the fact that supply chains are recognized as a critical part of the institutional infrastructure. And any failure within the supply chain will affect revenue because we are the ones who are driving the costs. I mean, all the various functions that work, the user departments that work with supply chain will have to ensure that they're working within cost or optimizing the cost at the same time as meeting the total cost of ownership. And the board oversight and the cross-functional accountability are now standard. So going forward, this is what we want to see more of, ensuring that there is cross-functional accountability. And now this is the basics of what we need for 2026 going forward. Next slide, please. So in closing, I'd like to share a few things. That as we do move into 2026, we're already in 2026. We should no longer be judged about how fast we are, that as soon as something is ordered, within 3 days, we've supplied it. But we should be looking at how we respond to critical things that happen, how resilient we are, forward-looking, planning and advising our user departments that work with us, and making sure that they are getting value for money and the business overall is getting value for money. The future, as we see it, belongs to supply chains that anticipate disruption. So by now, although budgets have been set, we should be looking at what could happen. What could happen that could derail us? Can we adapt in real time? What is our response time? And of course, like I've mentioned several times, create value or add value to whatever you're doing. Notwithstanding all that we've said, I believe that one key thing we should look at is developing our people, because the supply chain teams who invest in people today ensure they are attending the right courses and joining webinars like we're doing now, learning, discussing, speaking to vendors, and all of that, working with data, and all of that will be the ones who will survive in 2026. Because if you do look at some old-fashioned supply chain departments, and most people call it there's a procurement department, they believe it's only about purchasing. So the request comes through and they rush to deliver it. But because it's end-to-end, we're going to ensure that it's delivered safely, cleared on time, right charges are paid, it's stored properly, warehousing is able to release it properly, and on all of that end-to-end, and ensure that we are giving value for money for the business. So in a nutshell, adding to my able colleagues, this is what I believe that we should be looking at in 2026 for supply chain. Some people are already there, but others are also coming, and we should be able to help them to get to where we want to be. Thank you very much.